As a lifelong Sonic fan, I have been encouraged by the continually increasing quality of recent Sonic releases. The series hit rock bottom with the game known as Sonic 06, and has been steadily improving since, whether the mainstream games press wants to acknowledge this fact or not. This culminated in the outstanding Sonic Generations last year, which I consider to be one of the best games in the series, and one of the best platformers of the current console generation. Sega has just put out Sonic 4 Episode 2, which is obviously the sequel to the 2010 downloadable release Sonic 4 Episode 1. I didn't hate Episode 1, but it had its problems, and while Episode 2 is an improvement, it's not a complete success. Sega has made a big deal about the changes they made in Episode 2 based off fan feedback, and these changes mostly make Episode 2 a better game. The most talked about is the change to the physics engine, which has supposedly been completely overhauled from Episode 1. Right off the bat, I could tell the difference, with acceleration and momentum feeling much better. It's not quite as Genesis accurate as, say, the classic stages from Sonic Generations, but it feels a lot better than Episode 1. Unfortunately though, the homing attack has not been removed, and this is a huge disappointment for me personally. I really do not understand why the homing attack was even included in this game at all. The homing attack made its first appearance in Sonic Adventure, and it was only created because it was difficult to target enemies while moving in 3 dimensions. Sonic 4 is not a 3D game, so the inclusion of the homing attack is entirely pointless, and only serves to make this game feel less like the original games, and more like more modern 2D games like Sonic Rush and the like. This brings me to my main complaint with the game, the title. It's called Sonic 4, not Sonic Rush 3, not Sonic Genesis Tribute, Sonic 4. If they made a game called Sonic 4 back in the mid-90s, it would obviously be a sequel to Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Like any sequel, it would take gameplay and design concepts from the previous game and iterate and improve upon them. It would add new gameplay elements, new levels, and new bosses. This game doesn't even attempt to do any of that. Like Episode 1, this game is not really trying to be Sonic 4, despite the name. It is more like a tribute game to Sonic 1 and 2 with some elements of the modern games thrown in, like the homing attack. Awesome additions and improvements made in Sonic 3 and Knuckles are nowhere to be found in this game. Things like the elemental shield, mid-bosses, and the way giant rings were hidden in the levels instead of just being at the end. None of these things are in this game. When viewed as what these games are called, Sonic the Hedgehog 4, both this game and Episode 1 are a step backward. Part of what makes this game feel more like a tribute to the classic games than a true sequel are the levels themselves. Episode 2 is actually an improvement over Episode 1 in this regard, but it still suffers from the same issue. In Episode 1, every level was inspired by a level from Sonic 1 or 2, with only the layout and some minor stylistic differences differentiating them from the levels they were aping. Episode 2 is better about having the levels be more than just a simple reinterpretation of an existing level, but none of the levels in the game are entirely original. The first zone is very similar to Aquatic Ruin from Sonic 2. The second has a little bit of Ice Cap with some Carnival Night. Third is basically Oil Ocean crossed with Sandopolis. The fourth is almost exactly Wing Fortress, complete with a version of Sky Chase as Act 1. And the final zone is Death Egg. It's called Death Egg. At least this time around, the bosses are completely original creations, whereas in Episode 1 they were ripped straight from the old games with some slight alterations. Despite the issues I have with Episode 2, it is still a good game. The levels are fairly well designed with plenty of platforming. The game never devolves into hold right to win territory, which is how a lot of the more modern 2D Sonic games play. And that alone is enough to make it one of the better 2D Sonic games of recent memory. I've already covered the changes made to the physics, but there are some other changes like the addition of Tails. Just like the old games, Tails follows you around through the levels and can also be controlled by a second player. However, I wouldn't really recommend playing the game this way, as it's really hard to keep up with the other player when you're playing as Tails, making the two-player mode almost pointless. Tails still has the same abilities he had in Sonic 3, like being able to fly Sonic to out-of-reach locations or swim in water. This time around though, you can initiate these abilities as Sonic, so you don't have to plug in a second controller to have access to these moves. Tails even has a new move, which is basically a combo spin dash with Sonic that can break down certain walls and plow through enemies. Continuing on the positive side, the special stage is a huge improvement over Episode 1. Episode 1 had like a bastardized version of the Sonic 1 special stage, which was never really one of the better ones to begin with. Episode 2's special stage is almost exactly like the Sonic 2 special stage, which means already it has an advantage over Episode 1. However, just like in Sonic 2, some of the later stages can be very difficult, and become much easier if you have a second player controlling Tails. While I prefer Blue Sphere from Sonic 3 and Knuckles over the Sonic 2 special stage, this is still much better than Episode 1's, and if they weren't going to come up with something entirely original, this was a good choice. One of the disappointing aspects of Episode 1 was the length, and Episode 2 is pretty much the same in that regard. The game consists of 4 zones with 3 acts and a boss per zone, with a final zone that has 1 act and a boss. 2 of the zone bosses are your typical giant robot creations, and the other 2 are against Metal Sonic. If you have Episode 1, the game unlocks Episode Metal after you complete the game, which allows you to play through 4 stages based off of Episode 1 levels as Metal Sonic. He plays exactly like Sonic though, so other than the novelty of playing as Metal Sonic, it's not really a huge addition. In total, the game will take between 2 and 3 hours to finish your first time through, with things like online leaderboards, time attack, emerald collecting, and red coins giving you incentive to continue playing after the first completion. Visually, Episode 2 looks a lot better than Episode 1. The run animations have been greatly improved, and the backgrounds have a lot more detail. The game runs at a smooth clip, which is always important for a Sonic game. The sound effects are the definition of classic, though I still don't understand why they use the awful Sonic 3 one-up jingle when the Sonic 1 and 2, or even the Sonic and Knuckles version, is so much more memorable and iconic. As far as music goes, it sounds like Sonic music. And it's decent enough, though it just doesn't have that classic feel. It sits somewhere in between Genesis chiptunes and modern synth music. There's nothing wrong with it, but like the rest of the game, it comes close to capturing the feeling of the original games, but comes up just short. Sonic 4 Episode 2 is a perfectly fine game, and even a decent Sonic game, but like Episode 1, it should not be called Sonic 4. When viewed as a sequel to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, it comes up short in every way, and additions like the homing attack don't do it any favors. Episode 2 does make some key improvements over Episode 1, and is ultimately a fun couple of hours, but it pales in comparison to Sonic Generations, and fails to live up to the name Sonic 4. If you're a Sonic fan and you go in with the knowledge that, like its predecessor, it really isn't what it claims to be, you'll have a good time with Sonic 4 Episode 2. My final score for Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 2 is a 7 out of 10. Be sure to head on over to GamingIrresponsibly.com for more reviews, news, and previews.